Hi everyone, Chicken here. In the last lesson, we went through how different colors can convey different emotions and how we may capture the viewer's attention. In this lesson, we will be going over how to choose colors for light and shadow and block in the colors of our painting plan we worked on last chapter. Before we get started, let's go back to some color theory. I have a base shade here and I want to choose a color for the shadow. In traditional painting, we are taught to avoid using black paint to paint shadows because what we can get is a very dull looking shadow when we use black. So instead of black paint, the rule was to use a complementary color to mix into your base color for a shadow. Here you can see the difference between using black paint and green paint for a red sphere. Even though both the red and green paint are both pretty bright, you end up with a pretty dark shadow. And in contrast with using the black paint to paint the shadow, it looks a lot richer. Back to our canvas. In digital art, the equivalent of black paint is to just turn down our brightness. And as you can see here, when I make a gradient with that color, what I get is a very dull looking shadow and mid-tone. But at the same time, the way traditional paint mixes is very hard to replicate exactly with a digital palette. If I take a complementary color and paint it on, it doesn't look like a shadow at all. So I'll demonstrate how I choose colors to get a richer looking shadow with a touch of the complementary color. We'll get our base shade in first. And now for the shadow color, instead of just turning down the brightness tab, we will also be turning up the saturation, about the same degree as the brightness, and moving our hue slightly to the right, maybe about 10 to 20 degrees. This way we'll get a pretty rich looking shadow. And at this stage, if we want to introduce a complementary color, we can. Because our base is darker now, when we paint on a complementary color, it will actually look like a shadow. What I did was that I introduced green with a very light stroke, then I color picked it and painted it over. And to brighten up this shadow even more, we can saturate the transition. So I will color pick the middle tone and turn up the saturation by about 15% and paint it into the mid-tone. And we'll get a really nice looking gradient. Similarly, if we want to paint on a lighter color or a highlight, we will not only increase the brightness but also lower the saturation. Now let's apply this to our sphere. So again, for the shadow color, we lower the brightness and increase the saturation and move our hue to the right. This will be our terminator and I'll color it in. Now let's move on to our halftone. We'll pick a middle color, increase the saturation and paint it in. Now for our highlight, increase the brightness and lower the saturation. I'll now just paint in the shadow body with a dull blue for the ambient light coming from the sky. And similarly, our bounce light coming from the ground. The saturation of the bounce light color will depend on the surface color saturation. In this case, it's not super saturated, so I went with a muted green. And now that I have all my colors down, I'm just blending it in. And now we can paint in our cast shadow with the same technique. This time we can even try to introduce the complementary color in. I'll color it in really lightly, then color pick it and paint it in. And finally, our crevice shadow. And that's how we color the sphere. Now that we know what colors to choose for shadows and highlights, let's block in the colors of our painting plan from the previous chapter. So there are two different techniques I use to add colors. Color balance, which is a setting, and hard light, which is a layer blending mode. I usually use color balance for subjects that have a big mass, like the sky and bushes. I'll use it right now. And you can see we can adjust the colors based on the shadows, highlight, and midtones. So obviously the bushes are going to be a green, so I'm going to hover within that color range. And now get a blue for the sky. And we can always control the saturation and brightness. And I'll do the same for the leaves in the foreground. Now that I blocked in the big colors using color balance, let's color our character using the hard light blending mode. I just created a layer on top of her with the hard light layer blending mode. And I'm just gonna play around until I find a color for her skin. I realized here I wasn't in a clipping mask, so I'm gonna put that on so that we can only paint within the lower layer. I'll just keep on adjusting until I find a suitable color. And actually, there's not too much to worry about because later on we can still paint it over. The good thing about the hard light layer blending mode is that it'll keep the tones of the lower layer. So the highlights that we painted on earlier will still show through. For now, I'm just focusing on blocking the big colors in first. Later on, we'll adjust the colors of the shadow and light. And I'll do the same for the chicken. For the comb and the beak of the chicken, I'm gonna use the same color as the flowers. Like in the last lesson, I tried to avoid adding too many different colors, so I just make use of whatever colors I already have on the drawing. Okay, now that we have our base layers in, we can start shading. I combined the hard light layer down with the layer below, so now we can paint directly on her. Using the concepts from last lesson, I got a shadow color and started painting the dark side of her hair, where it is opposite from the sunlight. And same for the highlights. Now, because I feel like her hair is a bit too dark, I'm introducing some ambient light. It's gonna be blue because of the sky. And maybe some bounce light here from the flowers. Using the pencil select, I changed the color, the hue, saturation and brightness of her hair. I just adjust it slightly. And it's the same process of adding shadows to her skin. I think about where the light is coming from and what kind of things are in the way that will cause a shadow. So because our sunlight is coming from the right, most of the shadows will be on the left. And for the sclera of her eyes, I'm gonna choose a cream color, slightly less saturated and brighter than her skin. I don't want to go too white, otherwise it will look unnatural. And now for the highlights of her skin. Remember, between the highlight and the shadow, there's this extra saturated part, which is our halftone. So what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna color pick the mid-tone between the highlight and her skin. I'm gonna saturate that and paint it in like this. And I added in a bit of a yellow hue because the light is yellow. Here, I'm just bulking in more shadows of her chest. And again with the ambient light. Now bulking in the shadows of her dress. and I brighten it up a little bit with some bounce light. Some coming from the flowers there, and some ambient light coming from the sky. And the highlight on her dress became a bit dull, so I'm gonna brighten it up. Now that we finished coloring in our character, I'll adjust the flower color to match her a bit more. I feel like the highlight part is not bright enough, so I'm gonna add layer mode. I'm gonna detail her hair shadows just a little bit. Just the really big main shadows. Places where her hair would layer over each other. Or the intersections. The more you study other people's art and the more you draw on your own, the easier it is to recognize where to place your shadows. I highlight the dress a bit, just cause I think it's looking a bit dull. And now I'm just making some final color adjustments. And I'm happy with how these colors look. I think this piece is ready for rendering. For the mission, introduce colors into your painting plan and block in the colors for your shadows and highlights. In this lesson, we learned about how colors will change from light to dark, and we blocked in our colors to get a piece that is ready for rendering. However, even within shadow and light, there can be color variations. So before we start rendering, in the next 2 lessons, I'll go over specifically what colors I use to render shadows and highlights, starting with selecting colors for shadows.